Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience around the world on the webinar. Good morning to everybody here in person in Washington. And I'm very excited to welcome everybody to the first hybrid program of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington since COVID 2.5 years ago. So this is for us both an experiment and a very exciting day. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my immense pleasure to welcome you all to hear today the program Understanding Global Political Violence Implications for the Middle East and the West. Now, today's program, despite or in addition to being a hybrid program, is a little bit of a departure from our normal programs. We are partnering with the University of Chicago, Dr. Ali Nuaimi and Hedayah from Abu Dhabi to bring you a very interesting analysis in global trends in political violence, broader than just the Gulf, but I think things that you will find very interesting and very instructive, both for the Middle East, but also for the United States. Now, before we start in the program, I would like to introduce Dr. Ali Rashid Nuaimi, who is the chair of Hedayah, the International Center of Excellence for Countering Violent Extremism in Abu Dhabi, and a friend of AGSIW and of Chicago. So, Dr. Ali, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Doc. Good morning. Well, dear colleague, it's an honor for me to be here. We missed this place for the last 3 years because of COVID. I'd like to thank my friend Doug, and at the same time, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution and achievement of the founder, Marcela. She just sent me a message. She couldn't be here. At the same time, I'd like to thank my friend, Professor Pape, for engaging in these initiatives, being part of it. And since we met before 4 years, he believed in an approach that I see missing in many places, an approach based on evidence-based to deal with the challenges and the threat that the world is facing. There is things that, I want to make sure that our friends in the US understand it. The threat of terrorism is there, and it will never go by a wish or by a press release or by a political agenda. It will only be countered and defeated if the world as a whole come together and consider terrorism as a threat to the world, not to a single nation or to a single region. Whenever the word terrorism, mention, always our region is there. We understand that. But also the world have to understand that what we are doing in our region to counter terrorism. It's not only that we are protecting our people, it's not only that we are protecting our national security. It is that we are protecting the world. It's a threat that, target all of us. And this is where, we have to put our political differences aside when it's come to countering terrorism. I've been through this journey for many years. Before ISIS was there, we were dealing with Al-Qaeda, we were dealing with Boko Haram, we were dealing with Al-Shabaab, we were dealing with many militia related to the Muslim Brotherhood. And then 2013 started ISIS. I was one of the first to learn about ISIS, the threat of them. Unfortunately, and this is what I want to emphasize here, our friends in the West always underestimate the warning signs that we tell them about. And they think, no, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We have a plan for it. And then we saw ISIS. And many occasions, we heard, all of us, that ISIS is defeated. And people like me in the region, we are shocked to hear that ISIS is defeated. ISIS is there. ISIS is not only in the region. ISIS everywhere. And maybe you heard about the attempt to assassinate former President George W. Bush with someone who's affiliated to ISIS here in the US. They are in Europe, they are in Asia, they are in Africa. And you have to understand the threat of ISIS in Africa is more of a threat to the world than it is in Syria and Iraq, because of what's happening in the Sahel, what's happening in West Africa, what's happening in Mozambique. They control almost in Mozambique 1/3 of the country. And this is where, you know, we need to work together. This is a threat that we have to sit together, have a plan, work together, and a plan based on two things, based on prevention. You know, the security using the army is crucial and very important, and that's not the solution. We used it in many places. We were able to win battles, but we didn't win the war against terrorism. So it's very important to understand the threat of terrorism. This is one. Two, when it's come to using religion, it's very important to understand that you will not be able to counter terrorism unless you go to the root. And the root here is extremism, not violent extremism. And we are saying that because we understand the impact of using a verses of Quran or a saying of the Prophet on the general Muslim, who is not radicalized, who is not extremist. We see that threat. And Pope will mention, you know, many of these things. I'm sorry, Pape. You know, in his presentation, you will see, you know, in their analysis, they did the impact of using the verses of Quran, the Arabic version, you know, the Arabic verses, not the English one, which is you have hundreds of videos used by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda, by others. So it's very important to understand that we need to focus on countering extremism, and that should be using the educational system, using the religious leaders, the religious narratives. The religious leaders, you can't ignore them. They have a role. They are very influential. They have an impact. If you ignore them, they will play their role in a way that will hurt you and will undermine your effort in countering terrorism and countering extremism. And this is where you have to work with them and engage them, and that's everywhere. So it's very important that we need a strategy based on prevention and based on a holistic approach where you will engage all the stakeholders to, you know, immune the new generation from being radicalized. This is part of the message that I want you to understand. I want to pass to the audience, and it's very important that our American friends understand that what's happening in our region, what's happening in the world, have direct impact on their national security, on the American interest in the world. You can't protect your interest by press releases, by showing that you are a very powerful nation. No, you need to engage with your friends, your allies, you know, and build partnership and build common interest to protect your interest around the world on the ground. You need people who is not just working for you because they will take advantage of you or there will be a benefit for them. You need a long-term partnership. You need a long-term friendship. And here, it's not only government, it's the people. And I'll tell you this, when I visited the American pavilion at Expo, you know, when I finished the tour, I told the guy who was doing the tour, I told him, look, you American, you change the life of every person on this earth. Your civilization has great impact on everything, on the world, on the people, everywhere. But you don't market that. You don't utilize that. You brought electricity, you brought air conditioning, you brought all these medication. You are the one who invent all these. The iPhone is yours. You know, the internet is yours. But you don't market to the people everywhere, to the world, that this is that you are changing the people's life everywhere for the best. You need to work on that. This is the real soft power. The real soft power is not, talking about missiles or a new tank or F-35. The people, they don't care about that. You should bring the great American achievement to the general public everywhere. Show them what kind of impact the American civilization did to the people. So these are things that I'm bringing from outside. I want my friend here in the US to understand them. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ali, thank you very much for that introduction and that good message for Americans and others to hear. So what I'd like to do now is turn over the program to Dr. Robert Pape, the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, which we know by its acronym as CPOST. He's also a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. So, Bob, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It is a tremendous honor for me to be here, for Keven Ruby, and for Ibrahim Baig to be here. Thank you all for coming. I know Washington can be very, very busy. We're from outside of Washington, so for you to come to listen to us is really quite an honor for us. I would also like to say a big thank you to Ambassador Silliman. He has been tremendously supportive. We first met in the summer of 2019, and from almost the beginning, he has been tremendously supportive of our work at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and his staff here has been tremendous in helping putting this event together as well. I would also like to thank my good friend, Dr. Ali. I cannot thank him enough. He has been indispensable in the project you're about to see. And it's not just sort of material support, it's his time. So a number of years ago, he came to Chicago. He came to Chicago to our research center. He spent a day with our researchers. We were able to brief him in detail, to not just talk vaguely about the research that we did. And it was a tremendous day for us. And since that moment, he has engaged with us, and even with COVID, we've been able to progress and develop this project, and it is really due to him. So thank you very much. I would also like to say a special thanks to former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Secretary Hagel has endorsed this talk today. He's worked with CPOST for a number of years. He was just at the University of Chicago 2 weeks ago, where he received a preliminary presentation of what you're about to hear. He was extremely excited about this and thought it should come to the very highest levels of decision makers in Washington. He actually brought me to a special small group I can't tell you much about a week ago in Washington, so this is now the second time I've been in Washington. He wanted to lend his support to this, which is why he is also on the invitation. He is unfortunately in London today. He has to give a talk for the German Marshall Fund, but he very much sends his support and wants you to know how much he very much appreciates your being here. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to give you a presentation for about 40 minutes. The first thing I want to do is, since I'm an outsider to Washington, is just tell you a little bit about me. So I'm a professor at the University of Chicago who's been studying national security affairs for 30 years. But I'm also an unusual professor in that I've had a number of engagements with policymakers throughout that 30-year period. My first 15 years, I focused on coercive air power and economic sanctions. And in that period in the 1990s, I also spent 3 years teaching conventional targeting strategy for the U.S. Air Force. And that was during the days of the Bosnian Civil War. So it was my honor to be able to brief Checkmate, that's a very secret organization in the basement of the Pentagon, about the details of what I thought would be a more productive bombing strategy. And if you look at deliberate force, which is the bombing strategy we used to end the Bosnian Civil War in September 1995, you'll see it fits very tightly with the recommendations in the book Bombing to Win. That was the first engagement that I had with senior policy folks, and it was really quite an honor. And it was based on evidence. I collected systematic information about every air campaign in the 20th century that they found extremely useful. After 9/11, I compiled the first complete database of all suicide attacks around the world. At that point, no think tank had that database, no other databases existed, and it produced some very specific policy conclusions, which is that 95% of all suicide attacks are in direct response to a military occupation. About half are perpetrated by religious attackers, half by secular attackers. That allowed me to take that work to Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, who I knew from the 90s in other ways, and tell him that if we invaded and occupied Iraq, we would touch off the largest suicide terrorist campaign in modern times. At that point in 2002, no other terrorism expert anywhere in the world was making that prediction, and it was based on the evidence. Secretary Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, reviewed this. Then the word came back, Bob, we're definitely going to still invade and occupy Iraq, but we are going to move all our troops out of Saudi Arabia and open an airbase in Qatar. So that's how IUD Air Base opened in Qatar. I responded back, that will be some helpful, but we're still going to touch off the largest suicide terrorist campaign in modern times. And then we did occupy, we did touch that off, and it's the Defense Department that started CPOST. So CPOST started as the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism by the people that I was telling were doing essentially the wrong thing, and they then wanted more of the evidence. That allowed me to advise the Bush administration multiple times, including the NSC, on issues related to Africa, Somalia, how to stop the civil war in Iraq, which was based, again, on this more detailed analysis of the motive of suicide attackers. Well, anyway, that gives you a flavor of the kind of interactions that we've had. And so for 20 years now, I've been very interested in terrorism, very interested and focused on the Middle East, and I'm very interested now in what are the consequences of the shift of America's pivoting away militarily from the Persian Gulf. And that's something that I think is extremely important for the future of the United States, the future of the region, and as Dr. Ali said, the future of the world. So what I want to do today is now shift back and tell you about this exciting project that Dr. Ali has made possible. You see, we have stood up at CPOST an Arabic propaganda analysis team, which is not just a new capability at CPOST, but we believe it's the most dedicated research team to study Arabic propaganda in the world, certainly in the open source world. This is a dedicated team of full and part-time Arab language analysts and much more, as you're about to see. It's a 3-year funded project. We're just now finishing the year 2. And this project goes beyond threat monitoring to look for long-term analysis for deep insights. We want to understand Islamic group propaganda strategy and how it changes over time. We want to gain insight into recruitment and operational goals of the groups. And we want to gain early warning and anticipate threats in the future. Our APAT, as you can see from this slide, which lays out the goals, combines statistical and narrative analysis. And we think that's a unique feature of what we offer at CPOST. You're going to see, we're going to analyze militant attack trends. We're going to do large-scale analysis of Arabic propaganda. Essentially, with this team, we can do 100 hours a week of coding and analysis of Arabic propaganda. That's a fantastic capability. That's 5,000 hours over the last year alone. And then we do more than that with statistical analysis. Also, we've been developing early warning models, and we've developed a model for COVID. Many people wanted to know what's the effect of the pandemic as it spreads around the world. That, too, has been part of this project. After 2 years, what have we achieved? Well, we, of course, think we've achieved quite a bit. And if you look at this slide, I think it's just a tremendous testament to our research teams, to what we have done over the past 2 years, even with COVID. And we have either hit or exceeded every one of our pre-COVID benchmarks. This is our team. So this gives you a sense to look at both the Arabic narrative side and also the data team and also our leaders. And we have Ibrahim here today, who's the leader of the Arabic linguists, and Keven, who's the leader of the data team. And all together, this has been a tremendous effort. And I just can't thank them enough for all the high quality work that they've done. And I can't thank Ibrahim and Keven enough for leading this with all the changes we had to make with COVID in the last several years. This was a tremendous effort, and I can't thank them enough. Today, I want to show you some evidence. And you're going to see evidence of a renewed ISIS threat emerging, especially in Iraq. American forces, as you all know, are pivoting away from the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan. This is the biggest change in the strategic landscape in the region in over 20 years. This is creating potential power vacuums in a volatile region that is crucial to the security of the world. In a nutshell, what you're going to see is growing trouble in the Middle East. You're also going to see that we recommend a new strategy for stability to avoid a repeat of what we saw in 2013 and 14, that is a renewed surge by ISIS in the future. Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you things are flashing red, they're flashing yellow. And that means now is the time for preventive action, because otherwise we may find ourselves a year or two into this where it's flashing red, and we really wish we would have used this time better. Today, I'm going to divide this presentation into two parts, and then in the Q&A, please ask me lots of questions, because I want to throw them over to Ibrahim and Keven, because I'm only going to be able to cover part of what we have done over the last several years. But I'm going to first talk about trends in Islamic group militant violence, especially focused on the Middle East, in covering the entire year of 2021 and the first quarter of 2022, and then segue into an analysis of ISIS Arabic propaganda and what this means and tells us for the future. So first, let me talk about our 2021 review, and I'm going to focus only here on the Middle East. I'll say a little bit about the rest of the world, but in Q&A, please ask us about Africa and South and Central Asia. What you see in global Islamic violence in 2021 and compared to trends starting in 2018 is very clear pattern, which is that you're seeing a pretty constant level of non-suicide attacks in the key regions, that is Central and South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and a dramatic decline in suicide attacks starting in 2018 and actually preceding 2018. The decline in suicide attacks is a positive result of the withdrawal of American military forces from the region. However, that should not mask the conventional, that is non-suicide attacks, are continuing at a fairly high level and at a serious level, and that's something we need to pay attention to. Now, we might have hoped 2 years ago that COVID would solve this problem for us, that militant groups like states would basically stop many of their attacks because of COVID. Well, our COVID shock model that we developed 2 years ago said that was very unlikely to be the case. We've now verified that with data from over 130 states over 2 years. And what you are seeing is the results consistent with our model, which is we can't rely on COVID to bail us out. This is going to be the case likely in the coming years as well. So to be clear, those model predictions from the early warning model have come to be verified, and that tells us we have to be concerned about the future. I also want to just point out that we are doing here in this analysis is combining that excellent suicide attack database that I told you about before with an ACLID database that's actually managed out of England, and I could tell you more about the details of that if you want to know about that in the Q&A. Now, if we look not just at global statistics, but at specific countries, you will see very similar findings as we delve into them. You'll also see another feature, which is that even as suicide attacks are coming down, they continue, as CPOST has been predicting in its reports and articles, to overlap with civil wars. So the more you see civil war, the more you're going to see suicide attack, and that's important because suicide attacks are very, very, very deadly. And that pattern has continued despite COVID over the last few years. Now, this is all part of a larger study, as I've been telling you, but I do want to point out one thing about the globe before we move into the Middle East, and that has to do with the competition between ISIS-affiliated groups and al-Qaeda-affiliated groups. The big thing to know is that each of those, although there's some overlap in, say, Mali and Burkina Faso, in general, what you are seeing is these groups carving out separate spheres of influence. That's important because it also means we can't count on the groups to counteract each other. Now, to be clear, there are some areas of overlap, but in general, the big pattern for the last 3 years has been carving out separate spheres of influence, and that means we need to understand, again, one of the off-ramps we might hope for, the groups just fighting among themselves and solving the problem for us, unlikely for most parts of the world. So with that, let me now drill into the Middle East into a little more detail. The first thing I want to point out in the Middle East is when we look at both non-suicide attacks, that is conventional militant attacks, and suicide attacks, we see an overall decline in both. But what we see is a particularly sharp decline in the suicide attacks in the Middle East. This is important because, as I've been saying, that is consistent with our understanding of the relationship of military forces and suicide attacks. But that should not cause us to overlook that even though there's been a decline in the conventional attacks, notice how high they remain. So they're not declining from a low base. They are still a serious problem. And as we drill into specific countries, you'll see specific countries in particular. So this map shows you some context. So let's look at specific countries, specifically Yemen, where all attacks by militant groups, both non-suicide and suicide, are down. Syria, where it's essentially flat, and Iraq. Iraq is what I want to focus on and focus you on here in the next few minutes, because this is where the attacks are rising, and we need to pay attention to what's happening in Iraq. So, where is the violence growing in Iraq? Yes, violence in the Sunni areas, ISIS violence is growing, but the key thing you need to know about Iraq is that the Iraqi government is now facing 3 separate problems, not just ISIS. It's facing militant violence in the north with the Kurds related to Turkish military incursion into northern Iraq. It's facing Shia violence in the Shia areas in the south, related to internal political issues in Iraq, in addition to the violence that it's also facing from ISIS. This is incredibly important to understand because what it means is that it's going to be a huge challenge for the Iraqi government to focus on capping the violence with ISIS. It's got a three-cornered fight on its hands, and even though we may talk about ISIS being the most important problem that they should focus on, the Iraqi government has its hands very, very full, and this is something that we think we need to pay attention to as we go forward. Now, what about what's happening in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan? Well, the key thing to know in the data, whether you look at the non-suicide data, whether you look at the suicide data, is that there's been a dramatic decline in violence in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. Now, that's not to say that Afghanistan is a wonderful place for human rights. It's not to say there aren't huge economic problems. It's also not to say there won't be more violent problems in the future. But we need to look at the patterns of violence, and we need to see that even just before the takeover occurred, there's been a dramatic decline of violence. And it's not just recoding of violence that used to be rebel Taliban and now it's government Taliban, so we kind of ignore that and we can't see it. This is what we can do inside of the data to be sure that, in fact, violence is in general dramatically down. Now, where is violence a problem in Afghanistan? The key thing to focus on is ISIS-K in Afghanistan. This is something that in the summer of 2019, I was briefing Chris Miller in the Trump National Security Council, along with other folks at the council who are dealing with Afghanistan, would be a serious problem as we shifted away from Afghanistan, and it is still the case. That we need to be concerned that ISIS-K is trying to get a foothold and succeeding. And yes, the Taliban are fighting against ISIS-K, but this is going to be a challenge for the region, for the country going forward. Also in the future, there may be violence with the National Resistance Front, which are the remnants of the old Afghan government, which still exist, and we'll have to see over time whether or not they gain external support, and that creates another area of violence inside of Afghanistan. So, what are the global implications? Conventional attacks, that is non-suicide militant attacks, are likely to continue through 2022 despite COVID. Suicide attacks will also continue, but at low levels. The Iraq may well face growing instability in 2022 as it contends with a three-pronged fight. And data shows that Afghanistan is relatively peaceful coming into 2022, but there is escalation potential as we go forward. And in Africa, we will continue to see a scramble for Africa with likely separate spheres of influence with al-Qaeda and ISIS-affiliated groups continuing. Now I'd like to shift to how our research on how ISIS narratives have changed and what this tells us about the future. And you'll see that it dovetails with the attack analysis that we have just done. So as I told you, we have been spending an enormous amount of time doing large-scale coding of Arabic propaganda videos. This is an important thing to do because up until this effort, we have all known in this field that 90%, 85 to 90% of Islamist video and other propaganda is in Arabic, and we've all known we've only been able to sample teeny tiny little bits of this, maybe a soda straw worth. We've never been able to say, well, what's really in the propaganda in a systematic and reliable way? Well, that is now changing, and it's changing dramatically, and we want to show you some of those results. We're going to focus on ISIS. So with ISIS, the first thing to know is that there are three main narrative types in ISIS propaganda, and there are subvariants of each. There are governance narratives, which focus on legitimating ISIS boundaries and rule. There's videos and propaganda focusing on morale to boost the morale of existing supporters. And then there are new recruitment narratives. And the recruitment narratives, I'm showing you four variants at the bottom because that's going to turn out to be important as we develop this in just the next few slides. So this slide looks at how the weight of those three main narratives have shifted over ISIS eras from 2013 all the way to today. And what you can see is that the last era, since 2018, when ISIS lost its caliphate, to today, doesn't look like the pre-caliphate period. You might think ISIS would just revert back to 2013 and 14. That's not what's happened. Focus your eye on the blue. That's the morale-boosting narrative. And what you can see is that the last period, very much like the last several, but not the first, ISIS is focusing on boosting the morale of its existing fighters. That is reconstitution, far more than new fighter recruitment and far more than governance narratives. And that's continuing through this day. Let me also just focus you just in the last 2 years. So let's forget about 2018 and 19, and you'll see the same thing. That red at the bottom is the morale-boosting narratives. This means ISIS's top priority has been reconstitution. And that's something that's incredibly important that we understand, and we're going to delve even more deeply into this in the next few slides. This is an example of what a morale or reconstitution video looks like. Don't have time today to show videos. This takes too much time in a presentation. But what you can see are screenshots of an example video. And this shows you in this video that ISIS in the video is, this is focusing on Iraq. It's focusing on bolstering its shadowy existence in Iraq and operations at night. It's stoking fear of ISIS resurgence among the local Iraqi population, and it's using Iraqi news anchor footage to reinforce that messages. And there's many videos like this. You can also see what we mean by boosting morale with the pledge videos that all occurred after we assassinated the most recent caliph. So as all of you will likely know, in February 2022, just a few months ago, the ISIS leader was killed. In March 2022, a month later, ISIS, a new leader came in, and what this shows you are all the pledge videos that followed almost immediately, again, emphasis on reconstitution, emphasis on building support with existing supporters. Now, one of the nice things about this capability is that we can not only analyze things as we would see, fit at the University of Chicago, but we can respond to questions. So 2 weeks ago, when we gave this presentation, the former Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, he saw this and he started to ask some questions. So what I want to show you is that we've been able to answer his questions in just 2 weeks. Now, I can't tell you we can answer every question in 2 weeks. Okay, so please don't get it. But I want to show you, he asked a number of questions, and I want to show you what this capability can really do to be responsive. So the first question he asked is, well, where is the overall focus in ISIS propaganda? If we look at ISIS videos, where is the regions, where are they focusing on? And what you can see clearly here is that the overall focus since 2018 has been on Iraq and Syria. It remains on Iraq and Syria. And that's really important to know because that helps to establish what the group sees as its priorities. He also wanted to know, tell me about the main enemy that's identified in the ISIS videos. What can you tell us about the main enemy? And he specifically wanted to know, is the main enemy Arab and Muslim states in the region? Is it Western and is it the West? Or is it rival jihadi groups? Well, what you can see here is clearly it's Arab and Muslim states in the region. So yes, there are videos that fit each of those bins, but what we can now say is systematically what are the priorities. And we can even go more deeply and provide more granular information beyond exactly the classification he wanted. So we can actually go further, and what you'll see here is that if we look at all of those videos since 2018, all the way through April of this year, by the way, so you can see that it's dramatically focused on local and the region, not primarily the West. And that's very important to understand where ISIS is priorities are going. Now, he also, Secretary Hagel also wanted to know, what can you tell us from the propaganda that will help us get warning, an early warning on expansion? How can we use the propaganda per se to achieve that early warning? And so what you see on this slide is that propaganda does provide a proxy measurement. Specifically, at CPOST, we track new ISIS wilayats, those are provincial media arms, as an indicator of territorial reconstitution and expansion. So if we look at, since December 2017, there have been 12 new wilayats. 3 were merging existing wilayats, and those constitute as reconstitution or rebranding, and that's in Yemen, Syria, and East Asia. 5 only issued 1 video ever, so we call those attempted expansion, and those are the areas there. 2 were, of the new wilayats have ongoing production, so we count those as expansion. That is in Somalia and Pakistan. And just a couple months ago, in March 2022, there were 2 new wilayats declared in Africa, one in Mali in the Sahel and one in Mozambique. It is too soon for us to code those as reconstitution or expansion, but we will be able to within the next 6 to 9 months. So this tells us that, yes, we can use just the propaganda itself to gain insight into ISIS priorities. Then the last thing he wanted to know here, that at least I'm going to give you the time to talk about, is he wanted to know, tell me about what makes an ISIS terrorist. And what we were able to tell him back is what ISIS thinks makes a terrorist. And what you see is that it's not just one thing, it's 4 different recruitment narratives. There's not just one recruitment narrative for ISIS in the Arabic propaganda. There are 4. And there's the recruitment narrative that there are atrocities against the Muslim community, so rescue the community. There's a heroic narrative, which is about prestige, as serving as a role model. Then there's a religious rewards narrative, which is about gaining religious rewards in heaven. And then there's the yellow. And notice how big the yellow is. The yellow is a coercive threat narrative threatening to kill local Sunnis unless they switch sides and start supporting ISIS. And what you see here is in era 4, the most recent era since 2018, it's the yellow that's dominating the ISIS recruitment propaganda. Now, I want to delve into this a little bit more because we can go even further now that we have developed this to tell you more about ISIS priorities in recruitment. This is a chance for me, though, to tell you about, Dr. Ali mentioned this, our analysis of ISIS use of scripture and specifically Quranic verse. Now, before our efforts, to be sure, ISIS is famous for using certain verses, such as the sword verse. But before this effort, we really had no idea how frequently ISIS used verse. We had no idea what exactly what the surahs were or the chapters. We knew that there were some, but this was just the anecdotal information we had before this effort. This effort allows us to get a far more systematic and complete look at how ISIS is using Quranic verse. The first thing that we discovered as our major finding is that ISIS uses Quranic verse in about half of its videos. That's striking because it's less than most people, at least sort of experts in my field, would have thought. That is really striking. And so that allows us, that creates right away a whole series of puzzles. So the next analysis was, well, tell us about the surahs. Tell us about exactly what the verses are. And as you can see, ISIS is not drawing from just a narrow few set of verses or from just a couple of surahs, so many will know Surah 9 and so forth. It's drawing widely from the Quran. many surahs, over 560 unique verses here. This is a much more sophisticated use of the Quran than I think we really, certainly in the open literature, have known up until this point. Now that then led us to go even further. So once we knew this, then we decided to analyze verse clustering by ISIS. You see, now that we're able to systematically analyze verses across ISIS videos, we can start to analyze that even further. And let me show you the results of our verse clustering analysis, which I've never seen anywhere. I'm pretty sure we developed this uniquely, and thanks to Dr. Ali, we were able to bring this to you. So let's pick just Surah 9, because Surah 9 is the most common surah that is referenced by ISIS. And what you see right away in the pattern is that there are parts of Surah 9 that ISIS has drawn from really quite extensively, but notice the big hole. Notice where ISIS is not drawing from. ISIS is systematically ignoring a big part of Surah 9. And why? Well, that's our puzzle. What is the reason for that? Well, we're able to analyze that. Now, first, let's look at the quoted verses that ISIS does use from Surah 9. And these generally are calls for Sunnis to fight disbelievers. Well, that's not too surprising. So we're not trying to tell you that's the big aha. The big aha is the dogs that aren't barking, not the ones that are barking. So when we look at the surah, at the verses that ISIS is systematically ignoring, this tells us quite a bit. Because essentially what they are ignoring are the verses that discuss hypocrisy. And this is important because these would be the verses that would give Sunnis an out for not fighting for ISIS. These are the verses that create that scriptural out for Sunnis. And so this is important because we can now analyze not just what ISIS is doing in a positive way, but what's omitted, and hopefully this can be extremely valuable for counter-narrative development as we go forward. Let me just give a few examples here of videos. I know I've given you quite a bit to chew on already, but we can see this, the effect of this in the videos itself. So we can look at specific videos that are targeting Sunnis in Iraq, and we can see exactly how they are using Quranic verse in order to threaten to kill them and then ignore the parts of the Quran which would effectively undermine their argument. Ibrahim knows a lot about this, so absolutely please bring this up in Q&A, and we're glad to tell you more. There's another video example here. Again, I'm not going to take the time to show you the videos. I'm just showing you there are example videos of exactly the analytic points that we have just made. So, what are the implications for ISIS strategy going forward? Well, we can now see that ISIS priorities, we don't have to guess about what they are since 2018. We now know. ISIS's priority is existing fighting forces, reconstitution over recruitment. That means ISIS has not returned to its era, the pre-caliphate era. That's not the pattern that it's following. Morale, boosting morale of its current fighters is really crucial. And that's important because this then dovetails exactly with the prison break in January in Syria. This tells us we need to be prepared in the coming years for that, not just to be a one-off, not just an example. This is ISIS's priority going forward. Now, what are the implications for the Middle East? The broader implications for the Middle East is that an over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach has to be more than air power and intelligence and cooperation with local ground partners. We need, and this dovetails with what Dr. Ali said, we need to have preventive approaches. We need to have holistic approaches. It's crucial to develop political and economic tools for stability. It's important for practitioners and academics to work together, and that's why we're here. We don't pretend to be practitioners here. We're the academics, and we are here to try to find ways to work together. And we believe Iraq is a very important case in the next several years to develop this wider concept of the over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach. We also believe that strategic Arabic propaganda analysis can improve American and allied understanding of ISIS strategy and also other group strategy, both as it relates to treatment of Muslims and non-Muslims, and we've hoped we've demonstrated that here today. Thank you very much for coming again. Thank you very much for listening, and we are delighted to answer your questions. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. Dr. Ali, thank you very much for the presentation. I know that we've got a few people in here who can ask questions. Raymond, are we getting some questions from the audience? So there we go. So I don't know if anyone here in the room has got a question. We'll start. I mean, let me start with the question, because what I would like to do is to have you explain to me what you use as a definition of a terrorist attack. For example, when you talked about Iraq, you talked about sort of a three-legged stool. You've got PKK and Turkey in the north. You've got Al-Qaeda, ISIS in the middle, and Shia groups in the south. I assume you are not counting militia attacks on Iraqi or Western targets, for example, and that you're focusing on those that you ascribe to Sunni groups. If you can explain the methodology of what you consider a terrorist attack, so I have that clearly in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me say a word, and then let me ask Keven to say a word in more detail here. So what we are doing is, of course, there's a broad definition of what counts as terrorism versus not, but we're not trying to engage in debates at the level of definition. We focus on groups. We really focus on group-based definition, so that what we're going to do is study non-state militant groups. And you're right, that does introduce a number of questions, but that's where the value of this highly granular approach that we use in the suicide attack database and also the ACLA database uses, so that we're not just left with, again, this kind of broad brush definitional level. We can drill all the way into the level of specific groups. And with that, let me ask Keven to say a word about this.
I think the way to think about how we approach violence is, as Bob noted, it's about non-state actors. And we have a capability for, in the ACLA data, where it's a little more difficult, to pull out those attacks and then and events and look at those systematically. And the suicide attack database focuses, because of the nature of suicide attacks, it's easier to identify and limit to non-state actors. And that's the whole sort of framing of that data. So, as Bob points out, we're not very specifically focused on terrorism because people conceive of terrorism in different ways, right? So we're focused on sort of the concrete, observable, material event of a non-state actor engaging in violence.
There's a question right here.
Yes, hi, good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for convening the discussion. My name is Nate Rosenblatt. I work at the Counterterrorism Bureau as a senior strategist. And I also want to thank Dr. Ali for Hedayah's work. We've been working with you for a long time, and we really appreciate the work you guys are doing and continue to do in this space. As well as the Arab Gulf States Institute, I think our partners in the Gulf are going to be really critical in this next phase, as you outline, of the struggle against terrorist groups. I just want to pose a broad question here. I mean, I think we all acknowledge this administration's counterterrorism approach is sort of partner-led, leading with non-kinetic approaches where possible, building coalitions to fight these groups. And I wonder, because Dr. Pape, you mentioned at the outset, you noted that the light is flashing yellow. I wonder what, given all the incredibly detailed work you're doing in this space, I wonder what sort of macro-level political conclusions you might draw to advise this administration in its new counterterrorism approach to mitigate some of the threats emanating from the region. Thank you.
I think there is a very important macro conclusion, which is as the Biden administration is looking for mechanisms and vehicles for regional cooperation, I think the number one mechanism is going to be cooperation on data and analysis of terrorism or militant non-state actor attacks. I think this is an underdeveloped area of information and it's not just sharing of information, sending a few emails. I think that we have a real opportunity over the next several years to build as the core foundation for cooperation across the region, not just a counterbalancing coalition against Iran, or not just an issue here with Israel. Let's focus on where there's common interests. And the common interest, the one that's the most important, is developing cooperation around what we call terrorism, or as we're more specifically describing as militant non-state actors in the region. I think that we've had glimmers of this in the past, but I think it's really striking that we're not having a giant conference in the region this year led by the State Department on this issue. I think this is something that we could put together reasonably easily by the end of the summer. As you all know, President Biden is going to the region. You know, he likes announceables. Well, this could be an announceable for President Biden on the trip he's about to take in the next 3 weeks. And of course, then it would be up to us to put together the actual results, as usually happens. That's what I do when I tell them what the announceable is, and then they've got to figure that out. So it is, but that, sir, is really our future. So we really have concrete ways we can go forward that are crucial. And because, as Dr. Ali said here, we've seen this before. And so we know there is tremendous potential for ISIS or whatever group, resurgence, a Sunni group. You're seeing stark evidence of that right now. And there is a direct way forward, which is we need to jumpstart cooperation in the region around the issue of terrorism. And that should be the basis of, I would say, a major conference in the region by the end of the summer that we are ready, poised to go for it, but it's got to be led by the State Department. This is where the United States remains the indispensable country to be able to bring about that level of cooperation.
So I'll remind people in the audience watching the webinar, if you'd like to, if you're on Zoom, use the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll take your question right here at the computer in the front, and we will answer our first question now from our audience, which is actually a two-part question. I'm going to reverse the way he asked him. So first of all, he'd like to learn more about your coding methodology and what you choose to include and exclude as you're coding. But secondly, are there any particular trends of propaganda targeted at Iraqi youth or at youth as opposed to a broader Muslim audience in Iraq or in the Middle East?
Great. So let me throw this over, Ibrahim. Okay. Let me ask Ibrahim to say a couple words here, both about methodology and how we code narratives. So let's focus on that. And then I'll remind you about the Iraqi youth thing. But why don't we just give you a chance to tell them about that?
Sorry. By and large, our coding methodology is to try and code the entire universe of data. So we're not satisfied with taking just a small slice of the available material, but we want to eventually code all of it. And we have coded more than half of it, like over 1,000 videos so far. So our methodology, I would say in that aspect, is to get all of it and really see what it says rather than take a small slice and predict what the rest of it is saying. As far as the narrative structure goes, we have 6 clearly discernible narratives. Each of the videos generally almost always falls into one of those categories. And so they're mostly mutually exclusive categories, 6 subtypes that we code when we code each video. You saw the 3 broader types in the presentation that just went. But we have 6 that we code. We also code the videos to see what opponents are being mentioned and what scripture is being used in the videos, and if there are any calls to action as well. That's the first part of the question.
And then also interest in whether there's a specific focus on youth.
Yeah, so we have not seen a specific focus on youth enumerated by name. but there is certainly a focus on Iraqi recruits. And the method of well, I don't know whether to call it recruitment or reconstitution, like we mentioned. So there's certainly the theme in ISIS propaganda that there are these latent supporters in Syria and Iraq. We see that culminate in the prison break that happens against in the PKK held prisoners, that are ISIS recruits that are being held by the PKK. But the theme in Iraq in the past few videos that have come out in the past couple of years is about kind of reawakening these cells that are already there, rather than recruiting new youth specifically, I would say. And so the Sunnis are also targeted in Iraq in terms of coercion. So Sunnis who are perceived to be spies or working with the Iraqi government are they go in and invade their homes and execute them. And they do that as a message to other Sunnis in Iraq that, this is what happens to you if you go against us. And there are even cases of them using the same methods on Kurdish Sunnis in Iraq. So this coercive methodology of kind of carrot and stick methodology of, this is what happens if you go against us. Let this be a lesson to all of you Sunnis. Very different approach from that ISIS takes towards the Shia in Iraq. Shia in Iraq are not recruited. They don't ask the Shia to repent or anything. It's just unconditional enmity, unconditional warfare against the Shia. But Sunnis, the recruitment methodology in Iraq has focused a lot on these two things, reconstitution and coercion.
Excellent.
Let me make a comment in the way that I saw this implemented on the ground in the fight in 2016, 2017, 2018 in Iraq. I visited a town in northern Iraq called Bashika after Kurdish forces had pushed the ISIS troops out of it. And as I went around town, homes and businesses had written on the front in spray paint, Masihi, Yazidi, Sunna, Shia, Yazidi, Christian, Sunni, Shia. And those businesses that were listed as Shiite were completely destroyed. Those that were listed as Yazidi were completely destroyed. Those that were Sunni seem to have had no effect at all. And it was odd for the Christians. Some were destroyed and some were not destroyed. So again, is this a pattern that is consistent with what you see in the propaganda and the messaging coming out of ISIS, at least at that point in 2016 to 2018 range?
I think that's great. I don't know if we'll be able to go back to the slide deck. So Raymond, do I still have access to be able to, because I want to show so knowing Ambassador Silliman's interest in this issue, I just want to show him a little bit of, if I can get back to the slide deck just for a minute, where it says thank you. Yeah, right here where it says thank you. Yeah, okay. So what I want to do is I just want to go to a certain analysis, if I can find it here. So just a minute. Here it is, right here. And if we could, I don't move that thing out of the way. Yeah, there we go. So you, Ambassador Silliman had a chance to see also an early version of this. He too asked a question, very similar to what he just asked here. It's not something we can answer in just 2 weeks. But it is something that we're going to make the focus here in the next few months. And we've already spent a fair bit of time on this. So one of the big things that we can see in our analysis is that ISIS, people just asked about, well, what about the youth? Is it youth? What's really distinctive about ISIS propaganda is that it's not focused on age, although that, of course, there are some prominent examples of that. It's focused on different groups. And so what it does is it has a moral logic, Doug, that's different for Jews, different for Christians, different for Yazidis, that we can explain. At least we believe we can explain it, and we hope that in the future, this would give us early warning of any future ISIS genocide, so not use the past for the future. Now, specifically, we've made some key discoveries here, which is that there are redeemable and irredeemable groups. There are groups, as you're saying, Christians, where the harm is contingent, and it's contingent on their behavior. This is what you're observing as you're seeing those different homes being marked. Well, what we have done is we've been studying the videos that ISIS focuses on with Christians, which has that contingency, the videos ISIS focuses on Jews, and the videos ISIS focuses on Yazidis to get exactly the moral landscape that we've laid out. And to give you an example of what this looks like, so here is Christians. It's very important for ISIS. They saw Christians who would pay a certain tax as being redeemable, those not as irredeemable. And what you see in that moral logic is we can follow and track how ISIS is actually using Quranic verse, inside the videos to justify that moral landscape. Now, just to break away then from the presentation for a moment, so the big reason why we can't just solve this problem in just 2 weeks for you is because what we really want to tell you is not just what ISIS's moral landscape was, but whether ISIS followed its own rules. See, we want to actually analyze the patterns in the region from 2014 to 17 to see, is it the case that Christians who paid the tax were allowed to live or not? Now, either way, that's going to be extremely valuable going forward for any future genocidal behavior that we might see in the region. Because just imagine here, if we're able to show that ISIS doesn't even follow its own moral rules. You see that? So anyway, so we want to come back and tell you more about this in a few months. But this is, your question really was extremely helpful here, not just in a sort of a short-term way, but in helping us understand, because we do believe that these groups are going to commit harm in the future. And so we want to understand, is this a religious group that follows its own religious rules or not? Well, nobody, I think, knows that at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Looks like we have another question here. Let me, we've got, let me see. Let's go to Marianne Lazanta's question. She says thanks for the presentation, but misses one dimension, namely the role of Iran. Several Sunni Arabs in both Iraq and Syria underline the special relations between Iran and ISIS. Do you have any comment on a relationship between Iran, I guess either positive or negative, between ISIS and Iran?
Yeah, so you didn't hear it emphasized here, but I'm going to ask Ibrahim to talk about this. And we're not, I don't think we really are missing that connection, as I think Ibrahim is about to explain.
Sure. So in ISIS propaganda, the emphasis on Iran, I would say, is biased towards the earlier stages of the propaganda. When they refer to the Iraqi army in the first several years of their propaganda, they refer to it as the Safawi army. They don't say the Iraqi army, so they say the Safawi army as in reference to the Safavid Empire. The kind of purpose behind that is the perception that Iraq and its government are really just puppets of Iran, and also that the Shia faith is a puppet of Iran. So that's in the first several years of the propaganda. They strictly use that term. And then after that, it dies down a little bit, and they start to use other derogatory terms for Shias to refer to the Iraqi army. And there are a few videos where they display what they claim to be killed Iranian soldiers who are fighting in Syria. There's a couple of videos like that where they show dead bodies and they take out their books and say, look, these are books from Iran and stuff like that. As far as their attitude towards Iran, I would say obviously it's definitely an unconditional opposition to Iran. And their goal is to, they view Iran as not Muslims, obviously, and they view Iraq as a puppet of Iran. That's what I would say in the propaganda.
The one thing I want to add to this, thank you, Ibrahim, that's excellent, is that it's very important to see that what we're discovering is that the priorities of ISIS are changing over time. People keep wanting it to be one priority. 2013, that was the priority, it doesn't change. That's just not the case. It's not the case. I mean, the group's been through a lot in the last 8 years. It's produced a fantastic amount of propaganda in the last 8 years. What we need to do is we need to analyze that large-scale propaganda to understand how its priorities are changing. Now, some may not change, some may change. There's only one way to find out, and that's to do the kind of work that we've been doing to see what's really in there. And I think that's the value of this, we think this engine that we've really built with the help of Dr. Ali.
And let me go to another question again by Wolfgang Kepley, drilling down a little further on Iran. Have you seen any propaganda targeting Sunnis in Iran? Or is there any propaganda, I'm guessing here, that uses unique strategies or scripture in Iran as different from targeting elsewhere? And maybe, is there anything in Farsi as opposed to Arabic that you've been looking at?
So I'm going to ask Ibrahim to say a word in just 1 second. I'll just answer the Farsi thing. So we are focusing on 4 groups. We're focusing on ISIS, AQAP, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda Central. And that's because at the moment, that's the limits of what we can do with the support and so forth. So to go to Farsi would just be another giant issue. And it's not that it's impossible, it's that it would actually be a good thing in the future to build a layered approach to understanding the native group propaganda that emerges. But with that, let me ask Ibrahim to say a word about targeting Sunnis in Iran.
Sure. I hesitate from giving an absolute rigid answer, but generally the answer is no, there are not very many videos, if any, targeting Sunnis in Iran that I've seen. It's possible I missed something, in there in the data. There might be a couple of, I would have to look really closely to see if there are any Farsi language videos, but I can definitely say that if there are, they're very, very few. So it's certainly not a concerted effort to target Sunnis in Iran that I've seen from ISIS.
And since we have started a bit of a journey around the region, and since this is the Arab Gulf States Institute, has there been any trend in the propaganda talking about governments other than the governments where these opposition groups exist? In other words, other than the Iraqi government, targeting Saudi Arabia in particular for its support of Islam and its control of the holy places, other Gulf states on the other side of the Gulf, not on Iran.
Yeah, so I'll throw it over to Ibrahim, but the audience will remember I showed a slide of a very granular look at the certain states and so forth that are targeted, but let Ibrahim give a richer explanation.
Yeah, so ISIS has an interesting strategy when talking about Saudi Arabia. The mention of Saudi Arabia has faded, I would say, in the last era, 2018 and onwards, as they lost all their territory. But what I have noticed in the first few years of their propaganda is that the focus on Saudi Arabia really comes from Saudi recruits who have gone to ISIS territory. So they feature these Saudi recruits who have gone to their territory and are now kind of speaking back to the people in their own land in the Arabian Peninsula, kind of telling them to come there too. And as far as in the early ones in 2013 and 14, they frequently they mention Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the interior minister at the time, I think. So they mention him by name. And a lot of the main body of videos targeting Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states come from that era of 2015-16, where they still had a lot of territory in the region, in Syria and Iraq, and there were recruits going there from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and other places. And they are the ones who are given the task to kind of talk to the people of their own land and tell them to join.
Well, let's continue our sort of journey around the region.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me as very interesting in my time in Iraq is that the number of recruits that we saw in ISIS from North Africa, particularly Tunisia, but also Algeria, it constituted, in terms of percentage of the population of both militants and the smaller populations of those countries, were really quite large. So was there a specific propaganda push on North Africa, the Maghreb, and maybe even more broadly? Can you describe any differences between material that you see in North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa from ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any of the groups that you've been studying? Are the approaches different to what we've seen in the Middle East? And this takes us off on a whole nother analysis.
And maybe, so Ibrahim, I'm going to ask you to answer this, and maybe you could also compare what we've seen from Tunisia, or focusing on Tunisia versus Libya. So why don't we bring in, this is a chance to talk about Libya.
Sure. So first, to answer the issue of, is there kind of a difference between the ISIS side and the AQ side? The main difference is that ISIS is just much more prolific of a group in terms of the propaganda they release, just the sheer amount of it. And then AQ has a different style in their propaganda too. Traditionally, their style now is actually, I think, influenced by ISIS. Before, the Al-Qaeda style was kind of, here's a guy and he's going to give you a big lecture, right, for a half hour or whatever. That was what a lot of videos used to consist of, and they still do. The number of videos being released in the AQIM arm of Al-Qaeda is pretty low in the past several years, as far as I know. So it can't compete with ISIS. But on the other hand, ISIS, too, from that region, has not had much focus in the past several years since they lost their territory. One thing I noticed, which obviously requires a bit more research for me to give a really definitive answer, is that there's less focus in ISIS propaganda on recruiting recruiting people from North Africa than there is emphasis on showing people from North Africa who are already there. I found that in the early videos in 2013 and 14, a lot of the recruits who are just there when these videos start coming out are from Tunisia and Algeria and the rest of North Africa. So that was one interesting pattern that I saw. But as far as giving like real numbers and stuff, I would have to go in and delve into that a little bit more.
And so, again, going south then, you mentioned in the briefing that there is a lot of propaganda that is focused, and you're looking at groups that are more concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. Do you see any differences? Is the recruiting essentially the same? In other words, is the recruiting focused on finding or reconstituting militants in Nigeria, in Congo, in Africa to go against those governments, or is it focused on Iraq, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, or some other area? In other words,
so the answer,
local
Doug,
propaganda or
right,
global?
right. So the answer, Doug, is that we're going to know in year 3. So what we've done in the first 2 years is we have developed our engine, so to speak, and now we've run that engine with ISIS. What we haven't done is now, and even though we have collected and done some basic analysis of AQAP, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda Central, that's the area now in year 3 to really do that strong contrast, compare and contrast. So when we look at the other groups, their propaganda, the answer is yes, we've done some basic work, but to really do this type of analysis is going to take a longer period of time. And so what we should do is just see that this is in year 2 of a 3-year project, and we'll get, sort of stay tuned and invite us back. Oh, please, go for it.
Yeah, sure. I can speak to a little bit about the propaganda coming out of West Africa specifically. So first of all, Central Africa, we see in the propaganda a lot of operations being claimed because we track the ISIS self-reported operations too. They come out on a daily basis, and so we track those. And so there's a lot of activity in coming out of Central Africa, but not many propaganda videos. I think there's just 2 to date so far. The first one was like 5 years ago, and then one pledged one that came out recently. West Africa, as we saw on, I believe, slide 26 of the presentation, from 2020 onwards, West Africa province for ISIS has had a very heavy emphasis in the number of propaganda videos released. And I can even speak further to that. In the print propaganda, we've seen kind of an evolution of the activity there. A lot of emphasis on governance, right? To us, when we see these really organized, a stream of propaganda videos coming out, that shows us that they really have a territory that they're managing quite efficiently, because they're giving that priority instead of actually, staying alive. So we saw an emphasis on governance in West Africa. Last year, there was an article that came out in their weekly newspaper called An-Naba about collecting the zakah payments from people in Mali. And then we also saw coercive logic being used. So they claim to have wiped out Boko Haram last year in the Borno region of Nigeria. There were articles about that. There was a big video about that we've defeated the Khawarij, we've defeated the extremists. Interestingly, this fight with Boko Haram allowed ISIS to position themselves as kind of moderates compared to Boko Haram. So we've seen an evolution of taking over territory, fighting the government, taking more territory, setting up governance, and then consolidating to an extent where they've kind of split into two wilayats now. So there's Wilayat West Africa, which is Nigeria, the Borno region, Lake Chad region, and then now there's Wilayat Sahel, which is the Mali region. Before, these two used to be combined into just West Africa, right? And so we view that as kind of a measure of the level of consolidation that they have over the territory there. So there's been quite a lot of emphasis as far as the number of videos concerned with West Africa from 2020 onwards.
Can you please say a bit more about what you mean by governance? You seem to mean two things. One is their governance, but the other is the criticism of governance. And
Sure.
I'd also be interested in whether there's any difference in the religious messages in the Middle East and in West Africa particularly.
What I mean by governance in ISIS propaganda is ISIS showing themselves carrying out governing a region, having total control over the region and being the dominant authority within that territory. So they have borders set up, kind of border checkpoints. In some cases in West Africa, they actually show one of the border checkpoints that they have. And they are administering zakat, for example, administering charitable donations, carrying out punishments, having a police force in Africa. The video that came out last year for Eid last year, they show their policemen kind of patrolling the markets in this area. So what I mean by governance is they've set up a border, whether that's real or imagined, and they're pretty much controlling that to in a total extent.
But is that true for the governance categories that you had, which I confess I had taken for corruption and the evils of existing governments as part of the propaganda?
No, actually no. So when we code for narratives, governance means the display of what I just described, them controlling a territory. What you're alluding to, I think, we would categorize that under a different narrative, which is the social narrative, which is the need for recruits to come and help rescue Muslims, either Muslim bodies that are being brutalized or the religion itself, the religion of Islam itself. And that's what I think you're alluding to, is that these governments that ISIS portrays as these governments being corrupt and illegitimate and not being able to rule over the people, and then you, the recruit, needs to come and save the Muslims from that. So it's kind of a different category, yeah.
And this is one of the values of having narratives which don't bleed into each other. So one of the things we've gone to great lengths is to be able to develop the narrative types so that, and it takes a little bit of dialogue and learning what's inside the narrative type, so that's for sure. But once you do know that, then it's really helpful to see that we're not double counting the narrative types. We're not saying, well, it's happening in both of these or there's the overlap. Now, there will be cases in videos which are not clean, so there's some messiness. But nonetheless, it's really helpful to see that, as Ibrahim's explaining, the template here allows us to focus on how ISIS legitimates its rule versus demonizes the rule of others that harms the Sunni populations. And that's really just helpful to see that distinction. Oh, and actually the religious messaging, by the way, I don't think we've really can give you a good answer on messaging in the Middle East versus Africa at the moment.
Yeah, correct. We need to do a little bit more analysis to see, are there different types of scripture being used in the Middle East versus in West Africa. But I think that's a good thing to look into for the future.
Yeah. So you've just put another bullet point here for the future. Yeah, thank you.
Bill.
Bob, I have a question. You talked about the way that ISIS uses certain surah, and mentioned, you cataloged 500 or so of them that they use in certain ways, and they ignore lots of bits and pieces of these surahs and a wide. I just wonder, the engine that you put together has a use in helping like religious scholars or others to use that information as a part of a counter-extremist narrative to sort of demonstrate this is how ISIS is using Islam or the Quran, and this is what they're ignoring about the religion. Are there aspects of that?
Well, we certainly hope so. So tomorrow in the morning, we're going to the Pentagon to meet with the information operations folks to see exactly how we can help build those kinds of things, Bill. So we're not practitioners. Right. So we need to have dialogue with practitioners. Now, what we can do, though, is we can serve as a hub. So if it turns out that it would be helpful to go from what we know today at CPOST for the practitioners to have more work with religious scholars, piece of cake at the University of Chicago. We have a divinity school. I work with the divinity school. Dean David Nuremberg is also going to Princeton. So this is a network. So this is, the advantages of being at the University of Chicago and a scholarly network. So now, is that the limit? Because there's going to be obviously religious scholars in the region, Persian Gulf. There's going to be religious scholars in Europe as well. Well, I could easily imagine as part of that conference that I was describing with the State Department that we could have a side set of sessions on how religious scholars react to what we are finding. And that would be extremely helpful to us. But we need to find these vehicles for dialogue, as I call them. And so we can initiate some ourselves with CPOST because we have networks. But what we need is we need to then just look for opportunities, and hopefully some watching will hear this and help pitch some ideas to us, because we need those opportunities for dialogue, and we really have the material already to hold a very useful morning session with religious scholars. We just need that vehicle.
Raymond?
Thank you, Doug, and thanks, Professor Pape, for the great presentation, Ibrahim and Keven as well. My question also was related to kind of what could be done with the data and more on the practitioner side. I see Dr. Ali stepped out, but perhaps Abdulaziz can tell us a little bit more of what Hedayah is doing, working with religious scholars and working on counter-messaging in the region. If you can, Abdulaziz, I think it would be a great addition to this.
Okay. So I was saying that Dr. Ali, from the beginning, he mentioned that it will be his own under a better way from the capacity of Hedayah itself. But definitely at Hedayah, we have a lot of publications, a lot of programs that we participated and we have done to work with the religious leaders. Most of them working closely to the religious leaders themselves on giving them the capacity of bringing back the society and integrating them into closely to work away from getting these radicalized ideas into the society. But I think we can share some publications from Hedayah perspective on the programs itself that I can share to you. Yeah.
A couple of different questions. Taking a point that Abdulaziz just made about the rehabilitation of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other fighters, have you looked at in any way some of the rehabilitation programs that are ongoing? Those done in cooperation with Hedayah. The Saudi government has a big program, and I'm sure there are other governments as well. Is there anything in the messaging that you have learned from the propaganda that might aid these rehabilitation efforts to make them more effective? What messages might work?
So let me answer that question by first telling a story. So 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, I got an email from a representative of Saif Gaddafi asking me to come to Tripoli to interview people that he had just released after his rehabilitation program. At first, I thought it wasn't true, and so I didn't answer the email. And then I thought the next day, well, you know what? Maybe I should just answer the email just in case it was the case. And sure enough, it was Saif Gaddafi, not himself, but through intermediary. And I went to Tripoli several times, actually, as part of this. And there was a whole effort, Doug, that was going to be built here, which, by the way, was going to include the University of Chicago educating the civil servants of the central bank of Libya. That there was then the Libyan revolution in February 2011, which you'll remember, which totally changed everything. So there was a whole effort here that was started by Saif Gaddafi that didn't develop. Now, to say what could be done now, one of the key things, and this actually I didn't get a chance to mention previously, is that we are in a prime position to want to survey individuals who may have gone through rehabilitation programs here, but we need some help to do that. So there's a whole follow-on possibility here. Now that we're starting to understand the propaganda very well, to start to understand it from the receiver of the propaganda side. And that's something that we definitely would like to develop as time goes on in the future. And we think we're really, we've already do work with ISIS Western directed propaganda, so we have a lot of experience with developing surveys and so forth. And this is really a prime thing for the next phase of the project, so to speak, beyond the first 3 years. But that's something that we would need a real discussion about how to bring that about, because that's not something that we at the University of Chicago can easily identify those groups to be able to fill out those surveys. So we need the people to fill out the surveys, if you see what I mean. But we then would have the ability to develop those surveys in a very useful way, compare them to what we know about ISIS Western propaganda with surveys we've been doing of Muslims in the United States, Canada, and Europe. And so this would be really a tremendous way to go forward in a future development of the project. So not immediately, Doug, but not too far off.
And that definitely would be amazing. Because especially in Hedayah, just recently, we had published the first type of a blueprint on rehabilitation and reintegration center. So basically, this is like the model center, but not a very specific to a certain country. That is like the blueprint of the center that you can customize to certain countries of rehabilitation and reintegration. Put a lot of effort on all the practices, all the programs, covering all the aspects from A to Z on the rehabilitation center. So basically, definitely Hedayah can help on that along.
That's good.
So let me go back and talk about another geographic area that we haven't covered yet, and that's essentially the rest of the world. In Iraq, we saw a lot of non-Iraqi fighters. We saw a few Americans, some Europeans, some Russians, both ethnic Russian and from other republics in the former Soviet Union, quite a few from Asia. Compared to the Iraqis and the Syrians, the numbers were still small. But what can you tell us about propaganda directed at Muslims or even Christians outside of the region, and how did that fit into, in this case, ISIS's propaganda landscape?
Well, let me say a few words, and then I'm going to ask Keven to talk about our Western-directed work. So one thing we have not talked about here today is the work that we started actually in 2015 on ISIS Western-directed propaganda. So before this project, from 2015 on, we've been studying the narratives in ISIS Western language videos coming from out of Al-Hayat and elsewhere. These are videos that may or may not have Arabic subtitles, but they're primarily in English, in French, in German, and in other languages here outside of Arabic. So it's not those that are predominantly in Arabic. There are many fewer in number. They're several hundred, so they're not tiny in number, but they're not several thousand. And that's where we discovered in 2016 the heroic narrative, which is the Hollywood narrative, which is something you may have seen now in the press many, many, many times. So Keven was part of this project. We briefed the National Counterterrorism Center on the ISIS Hollywood narrative. We've worked with the FBI on this. This is something that we know quite a bit about. We've talked to the originator of the Hollywood heroic narrative, Chris Vogler, who's a Disney executive, about this. So we know quite a bit about this. And what we have done since is we have been surveying individuals in the West, both Muslim and non-Muslim, as they watch the different Western-directed narratives, which only include 2 of the 4 types you see here, the heroic and that social narrative, not the coercive narrative and not the religious rewards narrative, interestingly enough. And maybe, Keven, could you say a little bit more about what we have found in that research?
Yeah, so this has been a long-term project. Bob mentioned 2015 start. This is a Department of Defense-funded project through the Minerva Initiative. It is a collaboration with the psychology department. So our work on trying to understand the appeal of different propaganda narratives in Western audiences includes a survey behavioral study component, but also neuroimaging, because we want to understand the neural mechanisms that are engaged as different as individuals with different backgrounds watch different kinds of ISIS video clips that reflect these 2 different narratives, the heroic and the social. And what we've found is that especially converts are attracted to all propaganda, but especially the heroic narrative, as opposed to in the this is based on research conducted in the United States and Canada, as opposed to immigrants from Muslim-majority countries who largely reject the heroic narrative, but do find the social narrative, so the one stressing harm to the Muslim community overseas, as relatively more appealing. And so what we've been able to show is that the specific narratives employed by ISIS can be targeted to appeal to different audiences. And so even if a particular video doesn't make sense in sort of a context that we sort of typically expect, right? So the heroic narrative looks very different than the way that Al-Qaeda, for example, is messaging the West, right? It nevertheless ends up having an important strategic role. In this case, the heroic narrative is mobilizing especially converts to join ISIS.
And then let me just add a couple extra words on that. So as part of that project, we've engaged with neuroscience. So we've partnered with some of the world's best neuroscientists at the University of Chicago to brain scan people as they watch the ISIS videos. If you want to see a paper on that, go to Scientific Reports 2020. The journal's called Scientific Reports 2020. Look up my name, Robert Pape, Keven Ruby's name, and you'll see also some other people on there who are the neuroscientists as well. And you'll also see images of brains on ISIS videos. Now, it also will talk about the psychological predispositions and so forth. This is really the cutting edge of using science to help understand what ISIS is doing and succeeding with or not in its propaganda. This is something that we have been way behind in the West in using. So using neuroscience techniques like this is extremely common in pop music. So if you want to know why you can't get Justin Bieber's songs out of your head, it's because they use neuroscience to make sure that that's the case. And we, in propaganda, what we do is, unfortunately, we rely on the judgment of area experts who have incredible judgment value to offer, but they're not neuroscientists. They're not social scientists like at the University of Chicago. And so when we say want to bring a a whole approach. We really want to bring up the standards to fighting the propaganda battles here to the level of actual modern contemporary techniques that are used all the time, but just not with the case of propaganda against militant groups. And we are way behind ISIS use of these techniques because we're now discovering their use of certain narratives from Hollywood. So all I can say is that this is, we didn't talk at all about our Western directed work, but hopefully what we'll be able to do is start to move the Arabic directed work up to the standards we've achieved there. But that's going to take a lot more effort. It's going to take a lot more work, but now's the time to do it. If we wait until it's again 2014, there won't be enough time. You won't have the period of time to really do the studies. Now is the time when things are flashing yellow to use that time in the next year, year and a half to really bring our stuff up to world-class standards, and we can get there. This is on-the-shelf technology.
Thank you so much for this presentation today. I used to work at CPost a few years back, so great to
now
see
she's a
familiar
star.
faces.
We knew her when.
Yeah, thank you so much. You asked the question, how can propaganda be used as an early warning tool? And I think that's a really interesting question to be asked. On that note, can you talk a little bit more about anything you're seeing in terms of the amount of videos and how that's linked to effectiveness? Or you talked about the wilayats, and less videos seem to indicate that they had not quite gotten off the ground. Do you have further insight into what that means and how you can connect the amount and types of videos to the potential for atrocities or genocide in the future? And then back to Iraq, sorry. You mentioned the three-pronged fight that the government is facing there. Can you talk a little bit more about how your work connects with southern Iraq? If you have any insight, you talked about the PMF and tribal militias, about any future work you might do there or what you've seen so far.
So let me say a word, and then I'm going to ask Ibrahim to follow up. So, Brooke, it's been really common to focus on the production or amount of video or amount of propaganda, especially with ISIS. Very different, by the way, from AQC, which I started studying propaganda, militant group propaganda in 2001. So I've been doing this 20 years, right? So I've started with Al-Qaeda. I know quite a bit about Adam Gadon's videos and so forth in 2004 on. As the quantity expanded in the last 10 years, what you see in all the analysis is a focus on quantity. And it's because that can be counted relatively easily. You can go to jihadology and you can get the quantity very easily. You can also see sort of numbers of views. What's missing in all that is the substance of what's being said. That's what's really being completely overlooked. And quantity just doesn't get you that, you see, because you don't know what's really happening about how the narrative weighting of the different narratives is shifting even as we're looking at quantity. So it's not that, and Ibrahim will tell you about quantity in just a minute because he does know about this, but the fact is the whole point of this project is to get beyond quantity. It's to really marry that qualitative analysis inside of the videos with statistical analysis of those results. So we do use stats, of course, and you see that, but that's really the breakthrough we're trying to have occur with this particular project is how do we get inside the quantity of these Arabic propaganda? And anyway, but with that, let Ibrahim say a few words.
Yeah, so one pattern that we've definitely noticed is that the amount of videos that ISIS produces very clearly ebbs and flows along with the territory that they possess. So the quantity of videos rises in 2013, 2014 it skyrockets, I think 2015 is probably the highest year. I think they released like 500 videos that year. And then as they start to lose territory, it goes down and down until after 2018-19, it really almost goes down to a trickle. So now, so we went from 500 videos a year in 2015 to now, on average, about one per month, propaganda video per month, a narrative video. There's other news clips that they release of, this is a guy firing a rocket at PKK or whatever, just a few second clips, news clips. But the actual propaganda, the cinematic videos, are down to about once per month on average. So we clearly see that we can chart the decline as they start to lose territory. The video production starts to go down, and so that's another reason why we tend to kind of operationalize the amount of territorial control they have and relate that to the propaganda. So it provides us kind of a proxy measure, like we mentioned in the presentation. As far as the other question, I think it was about Iraqi forces, PMF. What I've noticed in the past several videos, for the past couple of years, 3 years maybe, the ISIS videos coming out of Iraq is that they are targeting several enemies in the video. So they're in the same video, it will feature them targeting the Iraqi army, what's called the Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, Al-Hashd al-Asha'iri, all in the same video. So they kind of view them all of them as their enemies, and their focus is, I'd say, less on the enemies. I think their goal with that video is less to talk about the enemies, more than to talk about, look, ISIS is succeeding against all of its enemies, and it's still there, it hasn't gone anywhere, that kind of theme.
Hi, thanks for the deep cut. This has been a fun back and forth. I'm sorry I had to duck out for a second, but I wanted to ask 2 quick questions. One is, this database you're building is fantastic. It's really fascinating. I think it's going to yield a lot of really rich insights into the way terrorist groups and non-state armed groups communicate their behaviors and activities. I'm wondering first whether there's intention to make this available for scholarly work and for others. As the State Department grows its data analytics capabilities, I think there'd be folks that are interested in looking through this in tabular form. And the other question I had, and the thing I think was, for me at least, the most novel and interesting portion of the presentation was about the the religious texts and the variation in religious texts that these groups are citing in their propaganda. And I think one of my colleagues mentioned the idea of sort of cutting that by geography. I think one of the brass rings that came to mind for me, too, is thinking about it by popularity. And I know that's a very complicated thing to measure, much more easily said than done. But thinking through, and I think we all recognize how responsive, in particular, ISIS's propaganda machine is to what they produce that is popular, how much views it gets, how much interaction it gets, what its supporters say about it. So it would be very interesting to see, of the surahs and verses that they cite in their propaganda, which ones are the most popular, given that there is quite a bit of diversity, quite an interesting bit of diversity. I'd be curious to know whether that's something you have thought about or have looked into. So thank you very much.
Actually, can I jump on top of that question? Because I was going to ask you a question about ISIS or Al-Qaeda's analysis of its own propaganda. How much analysis did they do? You may not know much from your research, but you then may. Do they actually look at the question of how popular a video is, how popular a message is? And if so, how do they do that? Because that may give us and others ideas on how to counter that propaganda.
So let me say a couple words here, and then I will, of course, let Ibrahim get a chance to say something. So first, Nate, it really would be helpful for us to have more than just a brief conversation about how to make a database useful to people in the State Department. So this is, so we're very used to working with databases. We're very used to having people wanting to, but at the same time, this is not simply a matter of put it up on a website, make it all free. Couple reasons for that. Number one is we don't want to be the world's repository for the best propaganda to recruit militants in the world. So we are not going to do that. So I did the first Martyr video project in 2008 for the Defense Department. I collected all the martyr videos in the world. I put together language teams to go to Sri Lanka, to go to Damascus, to go and buy things on black markets here. When we translated them, we subtitled them, and we sent. So you don't know much maybe about that, but if you go and look on DTIC, you will find that there is a gigantic project by CPOS done in 2007 and 2008 that is done for the intelligence community here that never was put. At one point, I was thinking, oh yeah, I'll just put this on a tab on our website. And then I realized what are we doing? That's not so now that's not to say we can't create information sharing possibilities, but then it's not just about like having a firewall. It's really about how do you structure this in a way that this is going to be useful. So this would take a longer conversation, but we really need to develop how to do that, Nate, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Just really quick on that, if
that's
that's
why
okay, given the conversation. We've been working with ACLED for a long time and helping fund and support their work, as Brooke probably knows much better than me. And you've cited it in your work as well. So I think we'd be very open, I think, to having a discussion.
So just try to create a vehicle for us to have this conversation. You're seeing Keven and Ibrahim here, so we're here for 2 more days, Nate, and so we've got time. The other thing I just want to say is, I'll just say briefly, I love the ideas about how to come up with different classifications for how to understand the scripture. But let me just let Ibrahim say a few words on that.
Sure, thanks for the question. It's a big question. I can give you a bit more details. So we do know, we also track how the verse is being cited, how the scripture is being cited in the video, and who's citing it. What we noticed, the discovery that we made is about 40% of the scripture cited in ISIS videos is cited by an attester. By attester comes from the older model of like suicide attacker videos. An attester is someone who's basically speaking to the camera, to the audience, or is directly being interviewed by someone in the video. And so the attester is the plurality of the scripture citations belong to people who are attesters, who are talking to the audience or the camera in some way. Now, it would be interesting to see how that compares to, for example, the verses cited by attesters versus the ones cited by, like, say, leadership recordings of the caliph and stuff like that. That's something we haven't compared yet, but I do think we have the ability to do, and it might be worth looking into. As far as the most common verses and surahs cited, we do have an idea of that too. We have a pretty good idea. There's one specific verse that's cited most common, but it's just a partial verse, which is used to kind of give an authoritative aura to whatever the person is saying. There's a partial verse. It's surah number 20, Surah Yusuf, verse number 21. At the end of the very last part of the verse, where it says, "Wallahu ghalibun ala amrihi walakinna aktharun nasi la ya'lamun." So Allah is indeed like powerful over all His affairs, but the disbelievers know not. Basically, the meaning. And so this is kind of used to seal off any kind of speech or kind of monologue at the end. That's the most common. The second most common is Surah number 9, Surah At-Tawbah, verse number 111, which goes, which one is that? Oh, that's Inna Allah ashtara min al-mu'minin, Inna Allah ashtara min al-mu'minina amwalahum wa anfusahum li'anna lahum al-jannah. It's basically saying that God has purchased from the believers their lives and their wealth in exchange for paradise. They fight in the way of God, and they kill and are killed. And so this verse is used, the second most cited verse, probably I guess the first most commonly full verse that's cited, or like a large part of it, which is in and of itself is not surprising, just that, because it's talking about something related to warfare. But as you saw our analysis of the whole thing, so our kind of point of entry into this as academics, as an academic research center, was that there's people out there who would just assume ISIS must be using 10, 20 verses over and over again, right? But we found that's really not the case. There's a lot of diversity in the number of and the type of verses that you're using for different purposes. I can even branch out further and go into more detail at a later time, maybe on like the print propaganda versus the video propaganda and what the kind of purposes are, I think, behind those and the way they use those. So there's even some differences there that we'll plan on studying in the future. But yeah, I hope that provides more detail to the...
See a paper on that.
Do you have any more understanding of how that's happening? Who's doing this analysis? Do they have? Is it specific scholars out of a school? And just another question: I don't think you've mentioned the Palestine issue, and I'm curious as to how that comes in. I was at a meeting in Doha last week on hate speech, and that was all over the place, obviously.
I'll show a slide on that Palestine issue, so why don't you take on the first one?
Okay, so is the question about how is ISIS themselves like analyzing the verse or planning out the verses that they're going to use? Okay, so yeah, so they don't have any external scholars that give them any sense of legitimacy, I guess. Their own scholars would be like their leadership, basically. So one of the big guys was his name was Abu Muhammad al-Adnani. He was killed in 2016. He was a Syrian fighter who became the spokesperson for ISIS. And as we know, the spokesperson for ISIS really means kind of the second in command after the caliph. So it really goes back to how many verses are being carefully placed there versus this is a guy who is just kind of being interviewed and he says a verse of the Quran to just remind people of something, you know. That aspect, I think, is less planned out, and it's just more like, well, this is the footage that we have of the guy saying this, versus, on the other hand, there are pieces of scripture from the Quran and Hadith that are part of audio speeches that come out. This is another aspect of their propaganda strategy, whereas that audio speeches of leadership were released, of the like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Muhammad al-Adnani, and the other spokesmen that came after them. These are very carefully constructed speeches. And those excerpts from those speeches also show up in a lot of the videos, to the point where a lot of the calls to action, calls to attack that are occurring in the videos are actually excerpts from these speeches being overlaid over like fighting footage and stuff like that. So I would say there's both. There's a very well plotted out, meticulously plotted use of scripture, and then there's also people being interviewed, which, like I said, form the plurality of the citations, which are less planned, I think.
So, Bob, let me let you address the Palestine question.
Yeah, so just this slide is a slide I prepared because I thought it might come up. And also, when I mentioned that Chuck Hagel asked me to go to a meeting last week, it was with former Prime Minister Ben-Ami from Israel. It was with the former head of Mossad. It was with folks who are very interested in this particular issue. So we did discuss this a bit. The big thing to know is that ISIS doesn't focus on Palestine very much. It did in a certain period, and you'll see that from the autumn of 2015 here for about 6 months. So it's not that it doesn't focus on it at all. It's that what we can see is that there have been no dedicated videos since April 2017 that have directly focused on Palestine or the Jews. And we don't have to guess about this anymore. So we know this with some degree, high degree of reliability. We can also identify the few lingering references that do exist since that period of time. So we can also address this. And so this is one of the advantages of the systematic analysis that we're providing, so that we can really try to cover the past, so that you can see when change happens, we can understand how rare that change is, and so forth. And that's just, I think, one of the big advantages here. Yeah. Well, wait 1 second. Let's let Ambassador Silliman. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that so what Bob's saying is absolutely correct, and it even comes to the point where in a editorial article from last year during May of 2021 that came out, where they did talk about Palestine, they actually, in the opening parts of the article, they say, like, we know people are saying we know people are accusing us of ignoring Palestine, and this they kind of like almost like they apologize for it. What their methodology towards Palestine is, they really see Palestine, the issue, as being subsumed under a broader goal for like universal war. So they view Palestine not as one specific issue, but first of all, they say all the Palestinian groups are legitimate because they're fighting for land, not for religion. And so for ISIS, the fight for religion subsumes the cause of Palestine, and that's kind of their explanation for why they don't emphasize it that much. On the other hand, the Al-Qaeda groups, they do emphasize it a lot, Their slogan is the slogan for ACAP in the Arabian Peninsula is "Qadimuna ya Aqsa." Like we're coming, O Masjid al-Aqsa, we're coming to save you. And so they did emphasize a lot when the Abraham Accords happened. ACAP released a couple of videos and statements that were specifically about it, whereas once again it's just the format of a guy lecturing people on why it's wrong and so on, not a cinematic thing like ISIS, but they emphasize it a lot more, and it constantly shows up as one of their main causes. For ISIS, like I said, they think of it as being subsumed under this broader warfare.
Okay, Bob, I'm afraid we've run through most of our time. I will ask you one last question. One of the things that has impressed me the most about the work of CPOST is the great potential for practical application. So I'd like you to close this session by giving us a couple of minutes on how you see the future of CPOST and what kinds of things would you like to accomplish in the next year and potentially in extensions of this program in the future.
Thank you very much. And before we close, I want to say again a giant thanks to all of you who have been here. That includes the audience who's watching us virtually as well. And Doug, again, I just can't thank you enough personally for how much you have supported this project here. And I can't thank Raymond, I can't thank the folks here at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington for this support. This is just a golden opportunity. The big thing I want to say, so I gave some specific examples here to the State Department about some things I'd like to follow up here. Also, the idea of building an actual relationship with the State Department. That's you can see that. The thing I want to really emphasize, though, is that what I've learned in my 30 years is that in order for new information to really have an impact, it has to be, two things have to occur. First of all, it has to be absolutely the highest quality information. It has to be the case that, that when experts in an area engage with this new information, they ultimately, not necessarily immediately, but pretty soon, have high respect for its quality and its reliability. And I think that's what you're seeing here today. But there's a second thing, which is regular interaction and dialogue. That's true in bombing strategy in Bosnia. So there wasn't just one briefing I made to checkmate. I engaged with 3- and 4-star generals. There was classified debate on this. So this was not just a one-off thing where you just did a memo and send the memo in and think, oh, well, maybe that. In fact, memos rarely have that kind of effect, as I don't know if I need to tell ambassadors about that. So CPOST doesn't do that, okay? Now, do occasionally do op-eds, and there are reasons to do things, but the bottom line is that what I've seen as the most effective is setting up regular interactions. Sometimes that's every 3 months, sometimes that's every 6 months, but it's an opportunity then for people to get to know the information so they can query it. So they can, if there are issues that come up where there's doubts or questions, we can address them over time. We're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes, but we go to great lengths to try to fix any of those we can. And that's the big thing we're hoping will happen as a result of this meeting. So Keven, Ibrahim, and I are here for 2 days. We've got 2 hours this afternoon from 1 to 3 where we're not booked. And we've got 4 hours tomorrow from 10 to about, well, it's not quite 4. I'd say from 10 to about 1:30 when we're not booked. And we would be delighted to interact with you. Also, it's pretty easy to come here from Chicago. It's not that far. It's not that expensive. And we fly Southwest. We don't fly first class. So we are a professor at the University of Chicago. We are at the university, and so we can relatively easily build those relationships. And so that's really what I hope we'll be able to have happen as a result of this meeting. And so thank you, Doug, for this golden opportunity for us to come. It's been 2.5 years with the pandemic, and now we have a chance to really start things fresh, and you've given us a great start. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. We'll close this out just with a little bit of a commercial. If anybody does want to get a hold of Bob and CPOST and you don't know how to get a hold of them, you can send an email to us, info@agsiw.org, and we'll make sure that that contact happens. I want to thank everybody who's participated in this in person, our State Department and other representatives, all the representatives, Ibrahim, Keven, Bob from CPOST, and Dr. Nuaimi and Abdulaziz Al-Abthani from Hedayah. This has been, for me, a fascinating discussion. At some point, I'm coming to Chicago. We'll do a deep dive on Iraq because I have so many questions. I decided didn't want to monopolize the conversation. For you in the audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you have found this as interesting as we have. We have recorded this session, and it will be available at some point later this week on our website and on YouTube. And if you have any questions, again, send us an email at info@agsiw.org. We'll try and get back to you. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your Monday. Excuse me, rest of your Tuesday.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.